Perfect.
I have already linked it in Zoom, so after it will open up for them. Don't worry about it. But you can always let them know to take their survey.
Got it. Cool. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Good morning. We're just getting started, so we'll get started in just maybe a couple minutes to get everyone a moment to get in and get settled. So in the meantime, I posted the materials. I'm not sure if you saw, but if you go on Canvas, I sent an announcement last night where you can click on this announcement, Ensemble webinar materials, and I attached all the materials we'll be going over today. So you can access it there. You'll have to download it and then unzip it, and it'll be ready to go. Cool. So we'll give it about another minute. Make that a little bit bigger. Okay. Okay, cool. Looks like we've reached critical mass. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Ensembles webinar. So the materials today, so just like our other our webinars, there's a survey at the end too. So we'll go for about an hour and then go over Ensembles in a little more detail. And then there's a survey at the end, so please take time to fill that out. And we do look at that feedback and we take into account. We're always trying to iterate and make these things better and better. So please be honest and forthcoming and totally cool. I have a thick skin by now, so I really want your candid feedback. So that's coming. Some of the materials for today, I collaborated actually with a colleague, a friend of mine. His name's David Yakobovich. He actually works with Emeritus too, and he collaborated with me on this material. And he's also the host of this podcast called Humane Podcast. It's an excellent podcast. It's a top 100 global podcast focused on AI and data science. So if you actually care to take a listen, I feel like I just give him a little plug here. Feel free to check that out on your preferred platform there, and I'll put a link up above. So very good podcast. So I actually love data science podcasts as like a side. Like I love listening to them. And it's a good way to, while you're walking to work or whatever, to just stay in the know with what's recent. So it's a very good one there. So here's an overview of today. And so we're going to cover each one of these concepts. Decision trees, we're going to talk about them because they're usually one of the preferred base learners in an ensemble. Talk about what an ensemble is in the first place too. We'll talk about bootstrapping because that's a procedure that's pretty critical to some of the bagging and random forests. We'll talk about bagging, random forest, and then boosting. So bagging and boosting are really the two main families of ensembles we'll discuss, and we'll give examples here at the end. We'll start showing some code. At the end, I'll have to warn you too, I usually like to build in some live coding just because I feel like it sticks better when you see it actually written out and you type along. But given the time constraints, I put a lot of pre-populated code, but we'll be sure to go and discuss each part that I have down at the bottom. So, and as always, as we go through this, I'm monitoring the chat and I'm monitoring the Q&A box. Sometimes the chat gets a little messy. There's not a ton of people joining us today, so I could probably manage it. But if you have a question that you really want me to answer, I'll definitely get to it if you drop it in the Q&A box. And so I'll try to address those as we go. Cool. Don't see any questions now, so we'll get going. All right, so that's the agenda. So first, let's talk about decision trees. We covered decision trees a couple weeks ago. The thing about decision trees is they're known as what's called a non-parametric model. So what does that mean? I didn't know what that meant for a long time. So what that means is, if you think of like a model like logistic regression and linear regression, those are good examples. We have a model, features, right? We have different variables. And what we're doing is we're trying to fit these beta parameters. So it's a parametric model, right? We're trying to figure out what, based on the data that we've collected, we're trying to estimate what is the population parameter for that particular beta. If we have two features in our model, age and income, what is the population beta parameter for age, for example, that we should multiply times age? Well, we'll never know what the population parameter is because we can't collect everyone in the world's age. It's too difficult to do. So we estimate what that population parameter is. And so that's what we're doing in these parametric models, logistic regression, linear regression. We're trying to figure out what those parameters are. We're assuming those parameters follow a specific distribution, like, for example, the normal distribution. In decision trees, we don't use those assumptions. We're not saying that we're not saying that this data follows any particular distribution. Okay, so it's a non-parametric model. Okay, decision trees are also very flexible. They can be used for regression or classification, which makes them an attractive candidate. And it's clear for interpretability. So based on how decision trees are created, they use each split to determine which feature you should split and at what threshold within that feature you should split the data in half. You use either entropy or Gini index, the Gini impurity. So those are the two ways you can determine that. And based on how the mechanics of how decision trees are actually built out, the most important features are selected first based on their impurity, their Gini impurity, and their entropy. So, at the top of the tree, here's like an example of one here for the NBA. The height, for example, is the first feature used. So all of the players that are over 6'6" go over here. All of the players that are under 6'6" go over here. So this is a decision tree that's predicting whether a player plays in the NBA or the WNBA based on their height. So, so the most important features are at the top. And so because of that, you can interpret the feature importance this way. So that's a nice feature of decision trees, and it can be extrapolated into ensembles as well. Cool. Also here, the fourth bullet here, random forests are, which is an example of bagging. So within the umbrella of bagging is random forest. Random forest is an algorithm within that family. And so they're a clear extension of decision trees to improve performance. Specifically, they reduce the bias and variance. Okay, we'll talk about how they do that in a bit. So one nice thing about ensembles is that they are really good out-of-the-box solutions to building a pretty good high-performing model. So particularly with like XGBoost, this is a very popular gradient boosted decision tree algorithm. It's an ensemble, so it's not just one decision tree, but it's usually like one of the prime suspects in one of those winning algorithms that online data science competitions have. So it's what we're learning today and right now in this course is very, very relevant in what data scientists in the practice do. They use these in the real world. So that's kind of why we're covering decision trees, random forest, and boosting in ensembles. So I talked a little bit how we build out a decision tree, but we can talk about it a little bit more just to review. So I think this visual is helpful. So imagine that you have two features. Okay, I've been using age and income, so let's just stay with that. So let's say X1 is someone's age. Okay, and then let's say. Yep. Okay. So let's say X1 is someone's age, and then X2 is someone's income. Okay. And we want to, I don't know what you would want to predict with that, but I've just using an example. You can use these thresholds, right? So if a decision tree, the first split, the Gini impurity is going to determine first, which feature should I use to make the split on the data? Should I use X2 or should I use X1? And let's say here, X1 wins out. Okay. Within X1, where should I separate the data to go to the left side of the tree and the right side of the tree? Well, you evaluate every possible cutoff point within X1, and you find the cutoff point, the threshold that has the best Gini impurity or entropy. And let's say here, the threshold 1, that's the winner, okay? So we draw a line up here and we say all the observations that fall in this space, this entire space over here, they go to the left, and all the observations over here in this giant space to the right, they go on the other side. Then when looking at just the left side, these are all the rows that went to the left side. Then you do the same exercise. You investigate for every possible threshold on X1 and X2, you find where is the right threshold to separate my data. And you look from X1 and you look at X2. And so maybe this time with this batch of data, you determine X2 is the best split. And the threshold within X2 is right here. And so this gets further divided. So you can kind of see how you kind of partition off these zones of, this is only in 2-dimensional space, but you can do it in 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, 1,000, 1,000,000 dimensions if you want to. We can't visualize that as humans, obviously, but machine computers can do that. And so in geometric space, kind of think, sometimes it's helpful to think about what's happening in geometric space to do this. So here's like if we introduce a third variable here, we have X1 and X2, and then X3 would be the vertical one. And you can also see how in geometric space you're partitioning out these little areas and labeling each one accordingly. Okay. Cool. So I don't see any questions so far. We've talked already a little bit about the mechanics of building out a tree. In a concise way, you can say you look at all the points, the cutoff points of all the variables, and then you pick the variable and the cutoff point threshold that has the best improvement in impurity or entropy. Okay. So, well, how do you know what is the best, right? So we use impurity and entropy to find the best split, but what is actually that doing? So we're looking at these labels. We also still need to have a, there's a few other options that you can look at. So there's classification error. We talked about entropy. We talked about impurity. There's also information gain. So information gain is related to entropy in that when you go down to another level of the decision tree, you're looking at, entropy is the number of randomness. Okay, so if you reduce the randomness, you're improving information gain. So these things are like inversely related. If you increase the entropy, you're increasing the randomness, right? So it might be a 50-50 mix of the labels. You're reducing the information gain from that, going from top level down to a second level. All right, so why not just grow a tree in an enormous giant tree to minimize this error? So the answer, and this is really important concept in machine learning, is that you do want to avoid overfitting. So our goal as a data scientist, we're going through this exercise, we're building a model so that not so we can have, you know, a celebration at the end and say, yay, I built a model, and it sits on your laptop forever and never gets used. We want to use it. We want to deploy it, and we want to use it to make better decisions. We want to create operational efficiencies. We want to use it so that it provides us useful information, but useful information on new data it has never encountered before, right? So I want to predict the stock price of Apple. I wish I knew what the stock price of Apple was tomorrow, but that's impossible to measure. So like you need to build like a data. That's where data science comes in, is you build in, you collect features about Apple, you like their past performance in the quarter, or their CEO's tenure, or whatever. And then you grab those features that you think are capturing that signal of stock price, build them into a model. Your model predicts a price for tomorrow, and you make decisions based on that. And so hopefully your model is not overfit to history, right? You want it to be to generalize well. You want it to be consistently predicting with a small amount of error. That's the goal. Okay. There's 3 types of error. There's error due to bias, which means that your model just is not doing a very good job of capturing that signal you're trying to capture. It's a crummy model. And there's error due to variance. Okay. And that's error due to when you overfit. Okay. So you can do this. That's why we do this train test split. Is you see here, this is our training error. This is our data set that we've partitioned off to fit our model. Okay. And you see, as we grow our tree deeper and deeper and deeper, that the training error continues to decline. Okay. And it goes down lower, lower, and lower. We can go just to a point where we have one observation in our training set in every single node, and we predict it perfectly. You can't always do that, but it's possible. But you'll notice the true error, this is the error that is on data it has never encountered before. It'll decrease along with your training error. You're reducing the bias in this area, right? You're reducing the bias, becoming better and better and better until you hit an inflection point here where it's no longer beneficial to keep increasing the complexity of your model. You see that now at this point, you're not getting any more gains on new data by increasing the complexity. And so actually the training error starts to go up as you add more and continue to overfit your model. So you want to find that sweet spot. So one of the things about decision trees too is that they're prone to overfitting. Like overfitting is a real problem with a single decision tree. And so there are what's called regularization methods that minimize the overfitting. So we haven't talked, I don't think, about regularization in depth, but there's one purpose: to avoid overfitting. That's it. Okay. And so there's more than one method. We'll talk about, I think we've talked about ridge regression and stuff like that. And ridge regression is just a term that you add to your cost function that prevents overfitting. That's it. Prevents the beta parameters from overfitting themselves. So there's regularization in other forms too, like with decision trees, there's the tree depth. You can limit how deep your tree grows, number of leaves, number of nodes, and so forth, all these. So since decision trees are prone to overfitting, there's a lot of regularization techniques there that are available to you. But you'll see later on, particularly with bagging in Rain of Forest, the property of overfitting is taken to our advantage. Okay. So another thing about decision trees that I want to mention, and I've mentioned this before, is that decision trees are what's known as unstable. So a small change in the training samples, right? So if I take out a couple rows and put in a few new rows and refit a tree, I might get a drastically different tree. Okay. With a small change produces a large difference in what the outcome, like the outcome tree is. So both of those things are taken to our advantage with ensembles. So there's a question, can we use ridge or lasso regularization with XGBoost and decision trees? I believe you can. Yeah. So the XGBoost is a special one. It's a little adapted. There's a cost function for that one, particularly when you're doing like a regression task with XGBoost. I believe you can put a ridge regularization on that, but I have to, don't quote me on that one, but I'm pretty sure that you can. That's something I'd have to Google later. Let me get to do that. But you don't need to go overboard with regularization techniques with ridge and lasso. Like if you, you just want to find that sweet spot. You don't really care how you get there. You can either use some of these techniques like the tree depth or number of leads, number of nodes in conjunction with ridge. You maybe don't need both, but or just one of them. So sort of that's the art part of data science, is figuring that out. It comes with experience. That's a good question. Cool. All right, so we've talked about decision trees. We reviewed that. Let's talk about bootstrapping. So this is a concept of sampling, really, and it's critical to the ensembles with in that I mentioned that decision trees are unstable. So if you change out a few samples, you might get a drastically different looking tree. So we try to leverage this. Our goal is we want something, an ensemble, which is just a collection of simpler base models tied together that make a single prediction. And what we would like to do is we would like to have an ensemble, let's say of 10, let's keep it simple, 10 decision trees, okay? And each decision tree is making their own predictions on the training sets. At the end, we'll somehow aggregate those 10 predictions into a single prediction. But what we like to do is have each of the 10 trees a little bit different from each other. We don't want them all to be the same tree, right? We want them to be a little bit different. So what we do is, if we were to have, we're going to use, this is the algorithm for bootstrapping only, right? So what you do in a bootstrap sample is that you have a sample of data and you have n observations. And so what you do, if you want to estimate some sort of statistic like the median or the mean, you could take a bootstrap sample, which is taking sampling with replacement, where the size of your sample is size n, but there are duplicate rows and some rows that are left out altogether. Okay, so you create a sample by picking points from there randomly in number of times. So the number of rows in your sample is the same number of rows in your original data set, right? So a particular point, x of I, can appear there many times. So it's simply duplicated, or it could not appear at all. So, and then using these bootstrap samples, you could estimate what that parameter with the median, what's the median of my bootstrap sample, and you take, the central limit theorem tells us that this is an effective way to approximate that. Okay. The math is, don't get scared with all these math symbols, okay? I don't, like if I sat down for 30 minutes or 20 minutes, I think I have full confidence that any of us could understand this, but I'd rather have you take away the intuitive point here first of like what a bootstrap sample is, okay? You take a sample with replacement that has the same number of rows as your original data set. Where observations are duplicated and some are left out altogether. Okay. And so the idea is that we're going to use that bootstrap sample. If we're having an ensemble with 10 decision trees in there, we're going to make 10 bootstrap samples, and each decision tree is going to be fit on its own set of bootstrap samples, okay? And because decision trees are unstable, the idea is that each of those trees is going to be a lot different from each other. And so we want that diversity in our set of ensembles so that, we have trees that capture all those weird, corner cases. So the aggregation of this diverse set of tree predictions would be a good prediction, okay? And we also, within each of the 10 decision trees, we want that each individual decision tree, we want it to be overfit to its particular bootstrapped sample. So we want to let that tree grow long, okay? Let it grow big, let it get overfit to that particular batch of data, and then let the next tree get overfit to its own particular batch of data, right? So individually, the trees will have high variance, okay? There'll be they're overfit. So, but after you average them out, you reduce the overall variance and increase the bias, or reduce the bias, I'm sorry. So that's the idea behind bagging, okay? And again, rain and forest is an example of bagging. It's within that umbrella. So, so bagging stands for bootstrap aggregation. It's bootstrap because it's bootstrap sample. It's aggregation because you're aggregating the predictions from each tree in an ensemble. So here's the algorithm for bagging. So for B, where B is a model, an individual base model, 1 to B, right? So let's make the big B 10. I just like simple numbers. So you're going to draw a sample of size n. So this is a bootstrap sample. And then you train your model on that. So f of B is the model that we fit to this bootstrap sample. And again, we're overfitting it to that on purpose. And when you're done with that, for every, you have 10 models now, each overfit to their own batch, you take an observation, and for each model, you make a prediction. That's where this part's, you make a prediction, and then you average those predictions out. The average is your final prediction. So for regression, like the average, car price or whatever for each of the 10 trees is your final prediction for that observation. For classification, you average it, you take like a majority vote, right? So if 6 out of 10, predict this to be a Chevy truck, then that's what you predict it to be. Okay. So a good analogy here is like the wisdom of crowds, right? So we all base our own experiences that we've encountered. We all contribute. Each of us are a little bit biased in our own experiences, but together, the wisdom of crowds, we tend to do pretty well. So that's that analogy. All right, so that's the general bagging. And the way that these are built is you're only sampling the space, you're not sampling the feature space, okay? You're only sampling your specific rows. What can happen is that if there's a really dominant feature, like that one is this really important feature that is going to be dwarfs all the other ones. Well, when you're constructing each of these 10 trees in your ensemble, even though you're switching up the row, you're switching up the training set each time on each one, the bootstrap samples, that dominant feature might always be the first feature that you use to split. So it might always be in each of the 10, the top feature in each of the root nodes. And so what happens there is you have all these correlated trees with each other. So to decorrelate those trees, random forest is an adaptation of bagging that decorrelates the trees from one another. So here's the training procedure. So we have an input parameter, okay? M, this is a feature, age or income, whatever. And so you're going to select, or I guess M is how many, it's an integer of how many we want to sample, okay? So we're in random forest, I'll give you the quick Cliff Notes version. What we're doing is not only are we sampling the rows with a bootstrap sample, but we're also sampling the feature space, right? So M is how many features you want to consider. So if we have in our training set 20 features, we might select 5, for each split, okay? It's common to use the square root of the number of features you have. So if you have 25 features in your training set, the square root of that is 5. So you might use an input parameter of 5. Okay. So for each model that you have in your ensemble, we'll stay with 10. We're going to draw a bootstrap sample just as we did before. And then we're going to train a tree classifier on with our bootstrap sample. But this time, as we're building the tree out, we're going to start at the root node. We're going to take a random sample of 5 features, and only those 5 features are eligible to make that split. So you're going to look at the thresholds within each of those 5 features and pick a threshold for one of those 5. Okay. Then you make that split. So now you're at the second level. Okay. At the second level, for each split, again, you're going to repeat that process. You're going to take you're going to, again, sample the feature space. You're going to take 5 random features, make a split there. And so with this procedure, you're really randomizing, the selection of how these trees are constructed. So you're introducing more randomness. So you get a more diverse set of committee of trees. So that square root of D, whereas that's the square root of the number of features that you have. That's an empirical result that people have just discovered. It tends to be a good value to use, like a rule of thumb. Okay, it's not a mathematical proven thing. Okay. Okay. So this procedure reduces the correlations, the trees correlate from each other. So that is bagging and random forest. So I want to take a pause here real quick. Is everything making sense so far? Like how are we doing? I've been talking a lot, I feel like. Any questions? I wish I could see like those little so and so is typing type of stuff, because I don't know if I know you have to type out all your questions, so I know that probably takes time sometimes. I don't want to move on too quick. All good, cool. All right, so we'll move on to boosting. Okay, so that's one family is bagging, examples reinforced. So ensembling, we've been talking about ensembling this whole time. So I should have moved this section up, but so ensembling is the process of combining several predictive models together to produce a single, more accurate model. Okay, and again, it can be used in regression, classification. They must be accurate, right? Otherwise, we just use a single, more parsimonious model, and independent. So their predictions are generated using different. That's the diversity. This part is the diversity we're talking about within each stream. So. All right, so you can also make manual ensembles too, right? So we've talked about bagging, random forest so far. Those are sort of out of the box prepared ensemble architectures. You can also create your own, right? You don't have to wait. You don't have to rely on scikit-learn. There's a thing called a voting classifier. Let's see if I can look at that. Voting classifier. Scikit-learn, it's the first option. And what you can do here is you can put a list. This first parameter here is a list of estimators. So if I make a logistic regression and I make a decision tree and then I make a neural network and I make whatever I want, I can just dump it all in this list here. And this voting classifier will take a first model, which is a logistic regression, and make predictions with that. And then it'll make predictions with my decision tree. Then I'll make a prediction with my neural network, and then it combines the results. So the voting is how you, like, there's hard voting and soft voting. That's the method how it aggregates, but you don't have to rely on just the stuff that's already built out in classes in scikit-learn. Those have to be scikit-learn models. I don't want to lead you astray. Those have to be like classes that are in scikit-learn, but you don't have to use random forest and gradient boosted classifier out of the box. You can mix and match if you like. Okay. Some of the benefits of that are that it generally tends to improve performance. So those XGBoost, those ensembles that win those data science competitions, generally they are like a manual ensemble, right? They're not all decision trees. There might be, there's an XGBoost model in there, there's a neural network in there, there's a few models working together. It's harder to train that. It takes longer to predict. It's more complex. It tends to perform better, but you have to always measure, is that improvement in accuracy worth your time to do? Like, how good of a model do you can always make your model a little bit better, right? Like, you have to at some point call it quits and decide, what's worth my time and what's not. So that's the manual ensembling. Just want to make a note of that. Now let's get down to boosting. So boosting is fundamentally different than bagging, in that before we were taking, let's say, a model of an ensemble of 10 decision trees, and independently each tree fits itself. All right, that's something you can parallelize. You can like send these trees off to their own database server with their own batch of data. They fit themselves, and then we can aggregate it afterwards. So they do that independently from each other. With boosting, it's different. So what we do is we start with a model, all right, and we fit our model on the data, okay? And what happens after that is the next model takes the output from the previous model and improves on it, okay? And the model after that takes that output and improves on it. So it's sequentially built out where each model is improving upon the one that came before it. And another fundamental difference is generally in boosting, you don't want to overfit your data to its batch of a bootstrap sample, because usually you want the base learner to be a very basic model that performs better than the baseline, but not overfit. And the idea is that a committee of very simple models will outperform a very complex one. So so this is the procedure here. We do a bootstrap data set according to the distribution. This is for AdaBoost, actually. So this is just, AdaBoost is sort of like the prototypical boosting algorithm. Generally doesn't perform as well as XGBoost or gradient boosted trees, but it was sort of like one of the firsts. So we still teach it. So the way that AdaBoost works is that you create a bootstrap sample and you give a weight to, before you create the bootstrap sample, you give a weight to every observation, where however many rows you have, it's a uniform weight, okay? You divide over n. So that's the weight of an observation. And then you create a bootstrap sample, okay? And you sample based on that weight, okay? So you take rows based on whatever the weight. So every row in the first one has an equal opportunity being sampled in that bootstrap. And then you take that bootstrap, you learn a classifier based on that bootstrap sample, okay? And then you need to go through this process of reweighting your observations, okay? So essentially what happens is an indicator of when you're wrong, right? So when your true label is not equal to your prediction, there's a 1, right? And when it's not, you adjust it by this formula here. And so essentially, in a nutshell, what happens is that you take your difficult to predict cases and they continue to get their weights increased the more that they're misclassified. The samples that are easy to classify, their weights go down because they're easy to classify. So as you get deeper and deeper into the ensemble, these difficult to classify cases get more and more of weight and more attention as you build out the ensemble. Cool. So this is the reweighting scheme, and then you repeat this process over and over until you've reached a good balance of bias and variance error. Okay. Cool. So that's the AdaBoost. Okay. So we'll talk about boosting too in just a bit. There's an example of it. But boosting works similar same way. So except you don't deal with these weights. With boosting, what you do, or like gradient boosted trees, is you're starting with a model that makes predictions on your training data, right? And then every model after that will make predictions, will use the error from that first model and make predictions on the error to correct for that. And the model after that will correct or further correct and correct. And so each model after that is just trying to correct the errors. Okay. So there's no weights with the gradient boosted trees. Okay. So let's move down to some examples. So this is the code part. So all I'm doing here is I'm importing a bunch of stuff. Okay. We've got some PyDot+, we got some matplotlib, Seaborn, scikit-learn, that sort of stuff. Okay, and we're gonna read in, we're gonna have 2 data sets today. The first one is for admission data. So let's take a look at what this is. So we're reading in this data set called admissions, and this is what it looks like. So this admit column is whether or not this student was admitted to the school. Okay, there's about this particular student, there's their GRE score and their GPA. And then this prestige level is a level of prestige at the university, right? If it's Harvard or Columbia, it's like a highest prestige. If it's, it's like maybe, a lesser known college, it's a lower prestige. So what happens is this is measuring how, like, based on these features, what's your probability of getting admitted. So we just dropped the nulls here to make things easy. And this is what it looks like. So we're going to clean up this data set a little bit. We're going to create class variables. So we're going to using that admittance feature, and we're going to map it to -1 if it's a 0, right? So if they did get admitted, we're changing that to -1. If it's a +1, we're going to leave it as +1. And our feature is going to be GPA, GRE, and perceive. Okay. So here's our train test split. It's bigger. So now let's look at how many observations we have in testing. We have 100 observations in testing. And in training, we have 297 rows. So good question. There's a question about, is there any improvement, statistically speaking, transforming 0 to -1? No, not really. It's just it's still a classification problem. You can have that be, 100, and you can have it be arbitrary numbers too, as long as it's binary. But for particular algorithms like AdaBoost and like some neural networks and stuff, it has to be -1 and 1, right? So sometimes, depending on what algorithm you're using, they have restrictions on what the target variable can be, but generally, no. Good question. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to build a basic decision tree, and we're going to put a max depth of 2. So we do that, and we have our decision tree. Okay. So one thing I'm not sure if you know, but there's a function in scikit-learn called cross-val score. Okay, and I'm going to go up again. Sorry, I'm going to go up to where I imported this. I imported this right here in line 24. Okay, so can someone tell me if we, in the lectures, have they talked about cross-validation? Does anyone know about that? No. Okay, cool. Cross-validation is really important procedure that you should do as any data project. Okay, if you're building a model, you need to cross-validate it. Okay, and you might be asking, okay, why do I need to do this? Cross-validation is for model checking. And maybe take a little quick departure here from the lecture. I mentioned this yesterday in office hours. This great article here by Scott Fortman. I'm going to put it in the chat. There you go. This is definitely worth a read to understand bias and variance. Okay, and so I mentioned that our goal is to build a model to yeah, it's a great book. Likewise, yeah. So the goal is to build a model that will predict well with new data. Okay, and so in order to sort of simulate the situation of like how our model is going to perform out there in the wild with new data, we need to do estimate how it's going to do on new batches of data. That's what cross-validation is, right? So I'm going to go down here. This is bias and variance. Imagine each one of these dots is the same model, but it's just predicting on different batches of data. Okay, so if the target here is what we want to be, is the true labels, these are the situations between bias and variance that we could encounter. So high variance, you see that depending on, we're switching out the data set only, we're going to see that we have predictions all over the place, right? And generally, we're like around where we want to be. Okay, so there's low bias, but we're just overfit. We're, depending on the batch of data alone, will give us a prediction that's could be well off the mark. Sometimes we're right on the money, but sometimes we're way off. So it's inconsistent. It's high variance. Contrast that to a high bias situation is our predictions are consistent, but they're bad, right? So this is just a crummy model. Okay, so you need to know what situation you're in, right? So if you're in a situation like this, you're a high bias model, but low variance, you need to increase the complexity of your model, right? So you need to put in some new features in there, put in features that are better, okay, that capture the signal you're trying to capture to move that closer, okay? But if you're in this situation where you're high variance, you have an overfit model. And so if you see your performance is one time 90% accuracy and the next time it's 40% accuracy, that's a big swing, right? And so you need to reduce the complexity of your model, take some features out, make it more parsimonious. That'll tighten up that distribution. So yeah, I highly recommend you read through this. It goes through an example with K nearest neighbor, right? And also talks about mathematically about what it is like. So highly recommend this this resource. So the reason I'm talking about that is that you don't know which situation you're in unless you test it. And so what we'll do is we partition our training set into these folds, okay? And so this is what where I lost my place here. Where was I? You do our train test split, right? So we have our partition of training data, okay? But we also want to know within our training data, let's chop it up into 4 evenly distributed pieces, okay? And then within each of these 4 evenly distributed partitions, let's see how our model does. So what happens here is we have a model DT. And what we did was we put that as an input parameter here and gave it our training data and a cross validation of 4. So what the model did was for this first number, it had 65% accuracy. We took these 4 folds, right? So if I had 100 rows in here, these would be 80 samples, 80 rows. I fit my data with those 80 rows and make predictions on the other 20, okay? And that's my performance on those 20. Then I would do the same process, except I would use, the other 80 rows, right? And so each fold, each batch of 20 rows gets used as the test set exactly once, and I record their performance. So I'm doing this to get a sense of when these 20 rows are left out of the training process and I make predictions on them, how well do I do? And so I'm seeing how well I do on new data, new batches. And so you want this to be consistent. Okay. So that's what cross-val score function does. It takes in your model, takes in your data, you tell it how many folds you want within your training set, and it'll do this cross-validation. This is and usually you take like the mean, like you take the mean of all these performances, and that's what your mean cross-validated score is. But this is for model checking. This is not for model building, okay? So what you would do is you would, you wouldn't take like, oh, I see that 0.75, this is the model I'm going to choose. No, you wouldn't do that. You might take the features that were in, that model and select that, but you wouldn't take an individual. Another question in here is cross-val score related to grid search CV? A fast way to get cross-validation score? Yeah, I would say they're definitely different. They're different, yeah, because I would say fundamentally because grid search is more for searching like you're searching the hyperparameter space, and you're going to find, it plucks out like the best performing model within that hyperparameter space, search space. But the cross-val score is simply just going to be execute like a function would. It's going to build a model and then evaluate it on the left out samples and then repeat that process. It's more like a helper function. Whereas grid search is like a searching. Good question. So anyway, I just want to take a moment to explain what that was, particularly because you've never seen it before. But it is pretty important to use when you're building models. So we've done a decision tree. I'm going to repeat this process with a random forest, and we're going to compare the cross-validated scores. So we see that just taking an individual decision tree compared to a random forest, we get a slight bump in improvement, 0.66. That's on our testing set. So we're just comparing those two. We're gonna pull in another data set. So this is the college data set. So I'm gonna take a look at this. So these are just more features about the particular colleges, how many applications they got, how many they accepted, what's their enrollment, and some other information about that particular university. Okay, so the Y in this case is a private, okay? So are they private university or not, right? And the X is all the other features there. So we have 777 rows and 17 columns. Let's do our train test split. Okay, so we do that. 25% of our rows are in testing. We'll build another decision tree classifier. This time we'll go a little deeper. We'll make it 5. We go down to 5 levels. Okay, so we fit that. And then now we can use cross-style score with our fit model and see how it performs. So you see we went a little bit deeper. And so we're moving along that curve right now of improving the bias. We're reducing the bias. We don't have, with every improvement in bias, the trade-off is usually you have an increase in variance, but the increase is less than the reduction in bias. So sometimes it's helpful to see a visual here, looking for this one. So we're making our model more complex. As we make it more complex, our bias error is going down, okay? And with a big, movement of here to here results in a big reduction on the y-axis of this bias error and not much of an increase in variance. But at some point, as we increase our model, we see that our variance error shoots up and the opposite happens. So that's what's happening right now. Okay. We're gonna take the score. We see our score is up to 90% for decision tree. Okay, so now we're gonna do our random forest, just like we did above. And we see our scores went from our test set from the 60s something to now 90 something, 94%. So just that improvement here with some of these configurations, we had a lot of gains. And notice that our cross-validation scores are fairly consistent with what our test set score was too. So this is actually a pretty good model, right? Like we can have with reasonable confidence that we're going to perform in this range when we just deploy this out in the wild. We know that we're going to miss some, nothing's perfect, but we're going to have pretty good confidence that it's going to be around this percentage, which is pretty solid. So we've kind of hit that sweet spot, I think. All right, so let's test out some boosting stuff. Here's our add a boost classifier in scikit-learn. So we're going to use the college, the data set we just used. We did our train test split, and we're going to try out this add a boost classifier. So what happens here is we have to pick a base estimator, and we're deciding we want to have a decision tree with this configuration. So for every independent learner in this ensemble is going to be a decision tree with 6 max features and a max depth of 5, okay? So that's the configuration, and we want to have 200 of those. So we're going to put 200 decision trees with that configuration. This learning rate is about how fast we converge on the cost function. So we're trying to minimize error here. And so what we're doing is we're using some gradient descent stuff to like figure out what these weights should be. And so this is how fast we learn that. Random state is equal to 1. That's just so that you get the same results that I get. So we fit that, and we get a 96% accuracy there, which is even better than the random forest, what we had before. Cool. So now I've just shown you a couple of quick examples of boosting. Let's take a look at how gradient boosted does. Okay, so we're doing a gradient boosted classifier. Again, we're predicting whether this is a private university or not. Not a terribly interesting problem, I would admit, but good enough to demonstrate how to do this in scikit-learn. So we have it on our training test split, and we're going to do our gradient boosted classifier with this configuration. We want, when we do our sampling of the feature space, we want to have 8 features, okay? And max depth of 5. And then we're going to have 400 of these individual decision trees in our model. Again, learning rate, this is how fast our model is converging on the cost function. So, if we put this as a high number, it's going to train faster, but it's not going to generalize as well. Okay, so if you put this at a low number, generally you're going to need you won't need as many estimators, and it's going to take longer to train, but generally it'll perform better. Okay, so that's what some of those things are. So still going really quick. The data set's not huge, and so we get 94% accuracy here. So let's see what this bad boy does on the admissions data. So we'll pre-process this admissions data again. Remember, this just had the GPA, the GRE, and the prestige of a university. So if we're predicting the admittance of a person to a university, we'll use a slightly different configuration here. We're jacking up the number of estimators to be 2720 or 2750. Learning rates even smaller, right? So this should be even a better model. So we're jacking up the complexity of the model. This is improving. This is us moving this way on this axis here. We're lowering the learning rate and then increasing the number of estimators. If we had more features, we could throw in more and more features. That would also move us this way. Go back here. All right, so let's see how this does. See, it's taking much longer. So that's a pretty small learning rate, and there's a lot of estimators there. It actually doesn't do very well at all. So we've probably gone too far on this axis here. We probably started to introduce more error due to variance than bias. So, okay. So that is some of the demos for the gradient boosted trees. There's one thing here about balanced classes, and so I'm going to run through this quickly in about a minute or so. Feel free to look through it more closely on your own, but what we're doing here is we're taking the private and the public colleges, and we're going to balance the data set first. So you see that there's more there's more private universities. So here we're going to take a sample of 200 of each. All right, so now we have 400 observations and we have balanced classes. What I'm doing here is I'm going to do a train test split and build this model with balanced classes. And you see that we have 100 estimators in this random forest, and our performance is about 97. So it's an uptick from what it was just a couple cells ago. Here's how we do on gradient boosted trees, 97%. So this is an example of what's called undersampling. There's also oversampling, right? So it's undersampling because the private universities, I'm only taking 200 of those, taking all of my public ones, but I'm taking a subsample of my private. Oversampling would be, let me duplicate the public ones until I have the same number of rows as my private. So that's that. So actually, this is the end. Here's some references, excellent resources that David and I used to put this together. Feel free to take a check them out. They're great. So a lot of them is documentation, but it's all good information. Are there any questions before we do the survey? We have just a few minutes to do the survey. Okay. Oh, here, next question. Yeah, so office hours. They occur every Tuesday, 6 a.m. Central Time. So office hours, should be a link here in this. Yeah, so if you click on this link, this will take you to the office hours. It's at 11 a.m. Zulu, like Universal Time. That's about to change, by the way, in a couple weeks. Daylight savings is occurring, I think, on like the 8th, March 8th. So that'll now be 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. I'm not sure which 12 it's going to become, but it's an hour difference coming up. But yeah, this is how you get to it. You go to office hours here on the left. You'll be able to see these. All the office hours recordings should be posted for your reference too. There's week 15, 16, 17. Maybe not 17's up yet, but these are all recorded. So you can actually go back and look at them too. Also, so the support tab isn't working. So I didn't know that. You can know that. So do you have ability to send me an email? Yeah, no problem. You can send me an email too if you have questions. Cool. Apparently it should be fixed in a few days, so that's good to know. Do you mind sending out the survey, please? I think we've gotten all the material done, so you might be emailed too. I'm not sure if it gets emailed to you. Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming by. Really appreciate you joining me today. Survey done. All right, good. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate your feedback and everything, and thanks for joining. Go ahead and close it up.